I've spent the last 2.5 months of designing, piecing, quilting, and assembling a scrappy patchwork jacket. I shot my stash, I used up all my little bits and pieces of fabric, and along the way, I tested a few new techniques. Today, I'm bringing you along for the whole journey. This project actually started in the middle of the summer when I got a message from one of you lovely watchers. I had been making this painted daisy patchwork block, and I asked you all to guess what I was actually making. I was making a bag, but one of you fed me this earworm that I couldn't stop thinking about. You said that this was the back patch of a quilted jacket. And after that comment, I just couldn't get the idea of making a scrappy quilted patchwork jacket out of my mind. And so this was the nexus of this whole project, this painted daisy. I think the hardest part of this entire project was deciding on which pattern to use for the jacket. I eventually decided on this green pepper pattern, which was really easy to use. And if you're looking for a pattern and you're just trying out garment sewing, this one's really perfect because you only need your home sewing machine. I'm actually using my Juki straight stitch industrial machine, and then I'm also using my Juki serger, but you can just do the whole thing with your regular home sewing machine. The painted daisy block that I'm making here comes from Thimbleberry's Big Book of Quilt Blocks by Lynette Jensen. I found the block really easy to follow. The only interesting part is that it just assumes that you know that you need to sew this with 1/4 inch seams, which is traditional for all quilting patterns. So I guess you just always assume 1/4 inch seams. I followed that through with the rest of the assembly of the jacket in the patchwork is I kept 1/4 inch seams for everything. And those 1/4 inch seams are probably the only thing that's actually consistent in this entire project. Other than that, like the fabric, they were all different sizes and bits and pieces. And even if they were some the same size, I tried to arrange them differently for each square. So these triangles, they're all the same size and they're relatively the same colors, but I arranged them differently just for my own sanity, but also my own creativity. I wanted everything to be different. I sewed together all these little bits and pieces first, and then I started arranging it in a way that would be the right size for each part of the jacket, and then I sewed those little bits and pieces together. Eventually, those bits and pieces were large enough to make the whole back panel, and then I used my pattern, I pinned it to the panel, I cut it out, and then I had the whole panel together. That was my general method for sewing together each of the jacket parts, and there's a couple things that I would do differently if I were to make this jacket all over again. The first thing that I would do differently is that I would use a larger pieces of scrap fabric. It was really tedious sewing all these little like 2 inch by 2 inch pieces together, and then it seemed a little chaotic just sewing these big bits together. So what I would do differently next time is I would use bigger pieces of scrap fabric. I don't think I'd go anything lower than 4 inches. And the next thing that I might do differently is I'd probably just use the quilt as you go method. The quilt as you go method is basically you start with like one patch in the middle and you sew that directly onto the batting. And then you consistently add new bits and pieces around and around and around on that one main piece of fabric until your entire piece is finished. Doing the quilt as you go method would have saved me a lot of time, but hindsight is 2020. This method worked pretty good too. What I ended up doing is I actually traced out lines every 2 inches apart and then I sewed that together. Well, I mean, I quilted it because I sewed the top panel to the batting every 2 inches, both lengthwise and then horizontal, which created these 2 inch by 2 inch waffle squares. I actually loved how the quilting turned out. It just took a long time doing this method. I should also mention that the lining isn't on here yet. I haven't even cut out the lining yet. I'm just quilting the top to the batting, and then that way when I do add the lining, you don't see the quilted bits. It'll just be a smooth, one cohesive lining. And here I am drawing lines on the arm piece. Each line is 2 inches apart, both lengthwise and then perpendicular to that. So it creates these 2 inch waffle squares. I really, really, really love how each little bit came out. Even after all that work with the quilting and piecing together, I just still wasn't sure about the size and the fit. I wasn't sure if the front panels were going to be wide enough. I wasn't sure if the arm panels were going to be long enough. But I figured, I was deep in this and I was going to finish no matter what, even if it didn't fit. Before I assembled the whole thing together, I needed to put the pockets on, and I decided to make the pockets a little bit more simple than the rest of the jacket, and I just used larger pieces of fabric. And by this point, I was sort of tired of the project, so I just serged everything. I didn't do any top stitching. I don't think I did, at least, not much other than adding it to the jacket, and serging made it so quick and easy. The one thing that I do differently on the pockets is I would make sure to quilt them so that it adds that extra level of cozy, but they turned out so cute, and I love how the purple and the blue just came out against the rest of the fabric. Next on the list was to cut out the lining, and I shopped my stash and I found this perfect purple fabric that I bought earlier in the summer from an estate sale. It just turned out that I had a lot of this and it went with the whole vibe. It's just a calm purple. It's light purple with dark purple, and I really liked how it came out. After I had the lining all cut out, it was time to do the assembly of both the lining and the outer part of the jacket. The assembly was pretty easy because I followed along with the green pepper pattern. The only thing that I changed was the collar, and I still think I'd make some changes to it, but it came out okay. Once the outer jacket and the lining were both assembled, it was time to put the whole thing together, and I'm making a jacket sandwich. It's very similar to what you would do with a normal quilt, except that you have, arms and an armhole, and you have a bottom and a side. So it's a little different than a quilt, but you still have your top, your bottom, and your batting in the middle. I did make a couple of mistakes and I had to pick out a lot of stitches, and that's okay. It's part of the process and it was a learning endeavor. Next on the list was to put the bias binding on the sleeve hem. I'm using the bias binding from a project that I did in the summer where I made a dress that I wore to a wedding. I had a lot of the bias tape binding left over and it was the perfect place to use it all up. And surprisingly, it was pretty easy to attach to the armhole. It was just a little finicky putting it through the sewing machine because I kept having to turn it, obviously, but then because it's on a sleeve, it kept getting wrapped around. So I just went slow. And if you were to do this project, make sure that you go slow too. If you're loving this content, I'd love it if you join my weekly newsletter. It's about a 3 to 4 minute read each week where I fill you in what's happening behind the scenes, catch you up on any content you may have missed, and my recommendation of the week. Usually I review and recommend a tool, but sometimes I even recommend a book that I just finished. There's a link in the description of the video if you're interested in joining my free weekly newsletter. Even though adding the bias binding was a little tedious and I had to do it twice because there's two armholes, it came out so good. I'm pretty proud of it. And, even the stitching turned out really good. I love how it looks. It's super scrappy, but adding the bias binding just pulls it all in together. And now it's time for the final reveal. It's all finished and it's super cozy. I am so excited that this project is finished, not only because this was a huge journey for myself, for my creative endeavors, but also because it took so long. As of recording right now, it's the middle of November, and I started this in early September. So that means that I have been working on this project for 2.5 months now. But I took a lot of side quests in the middle of that. And so it wasn't just like me working on it for 2 months straight. I put it down, did bits and pieces here and there whenever I could. And instead of just like working on this project from start to finish without doing anything else, I decided to do those side projects because I didn't want to get burnt out. When I have a really big project that is almost like overwhelming to do, what I like to do is do bits and pieces. So I did the patchwork part first, and then I did the construction of each part of the actual jacket. So I did like the two front panels and the back panel, then I did the arms. That was like the first leg of the trip. And then the second leg of the trip was the quilting. That actually turned out really good. I'm not necessarily surprised at how good the quilting turned out, but it turned out better than I expected. So, what I ended up doing with the quilting was I drew out lines on every single piece of the jacket, and I made these like 2x2 squares, and that turned out amazing. I wouldn't change anything about the quilting. And then the next bit that I did was the collar and the pockets were interesting. I didn't like how the collar finishing was, and if I were to do this jacket again, I think I would try to figure out another way. I didn't actually stay true to the pattern because I liked that worse than the way that I decided to do the collar. But I think I'd still try to do it a little bit differently in the next one. And then the pockets, I decided not to do patchwork on the pockets because I was just so done piecing little bits of scraps together. So I did larger pieces for each part of the pocket. But what I would do differently for the pockets is I would add the batting and I would quilt them too, because of right now, the pockets, they're a little underwhelming. They're not as cozy and fluffy as I would like them to be. And I'm going for like cozy vibes all around. And so that's the one main thing that I would change with the pockets. And then the next leg of the trip was doing the lining of the jacket. You know, I shopped my stash for this one. I just happened to have a really nice purple fabric that I bought at an estate sale earlier in the summer that, you know, it just fit. It blended pretty well with all the blues and the other purples and the pinks. So I shot my stash, I did the lining, and then I put my jacket down for a little bit longer because I couldn't do it. I wanted to do something else. And so that was another leg of the trip. And then the very last leg of the trip was folding over the front part and doing that. The pattern calls for buttons, but I haven't decided if I want to put buttons on or not. I don't have a home sewing machine anymore. So that means that I would have to do all the buttonholes by hand. And that would be a whole other video because it would take me forever to do. And I just don't want to do that. So I'm holding off on that, but it might happen in the future, not too sure. But then the very last part that I did was I added the bias binding tape to the sleeves. And that was actually really quick and easy because I used the leftover bias binding from my summer dress that I made to wear to a friend's wedding. And that's the one that sort of like sparked this whole sustainable summer wardrobe series, which is where my painted daisy patch on the back panel came from, and then where most of the scraps came from. So I used up so many scraps in the making of this jacket. I didn't buy anything in particular for this jacket. I did actually thrift the 3 blues. There's the dark blue, the light matching blue, and then like the sort of tie-dyed batik blue. I did thrift those. They're all about, I think, maybe $1.50 each. So that's 1, 2, 3, $4.50 for the blues. And I didn't thrift those with the intention of putting it with the jacket. I actually had thrifted those before decided to do the jacket, but they ended up blending in perfectly with all the pinks and purples that I used in the painted daisy and from that bedsheet, that king size bedsheet that just was never ending and I got so many projects out of. So the blues went perfectly with that. I thought it blended really well together. And then I added a couple of other scraps. So let's see, this light color purple and like cream fabric. These were some failed pajama pants that I made. I made these. I don't even know if I had a YouTube channel when I made these, but I made them a while ago, and it was when I was first getting back into sewing, and I sort of patched all of the pieces together because the bit of fabric that I had wasn't big enough for any of the pajama pant pieces. So I pieced those together, and it was really uncomfortable because there was like seams and weird odd places that I didn't like. So anyway, I never wore them. So I cut those up and I put them into the jacket. But the cool part about that fabric is that it's actually the backing of a quilt that my mom made, and she just sent me all the extra fabric. So that was also free fabric. There is another, what is that? This one right here is from a vintage sheet that I have been learning how to sew on for the last couple of years. So I had little bits of that left over. Wait, no, that's the vintage sheet from the original pattern. Here is the other vintage sheet right here, this like diamond part. I love this fabric. I wish I had more of it. If anyone has this sheet, it's probably like a 70s retro flower sheet. Please send it to me. I would love it. I would make beautiful quilts with it. The pink one is from a pillowcase, and what else? A whole bunch of other bits that I just had in my stash. I didn't buy any fabric, so it was everything shopped from my stash, including the lining, which I got from an estate sale. It turned out pretty good. I really like how it came out. It feels like wearing a quilt. You not wear this jacket out ever, but I think you guys are going to be seeing me wearing this a lot this winter in these videos because it is so warm in this quilted jacket that I will stay cozy all winter long. My craft room, my art studio is very cold. We only heat our house with our wood stove, which is in our living room. And so this part of the house stays pretty cold. It warms up quickly when I come in here and I have the door closed, but it never gets really warm. So that's why I'm always like bundled up with my scarf and my hat and a really big sweater because I'm just cold. I'm cold all the time anyway, but in the wintertime, I'm really cold in here. And the only other thing that I would change about this project if I were to do it again is I would make the patches larger. So each scrap was just sort of an amalgamation of what I had, and a lot of those scraps were really small. So I was using the small scraps. But next time, I think I would make it a little bit more intentional. I would choose maybe a patch that I would want to do the whole way around, like a block, like maybe a flying geese block. And I would make each scrap piece of fabric a lot bigger so that there's fewer seams and it takes a lot less time. Overall, I really liked the green pepper pattern that I chose. It was really easy to follow. I ended up going with the extra small. I'm not sure which size I was. I did this and I'll have to check and put it on the screen. But the size I chose was perfect. Green pepper is notorious for being like really large, especially for women because they are like gender neutral, everyone type of pattern. So make sure you just like look at the directions and follow along with your measurements, not just the normal extra small or extra large. It's going to be different for everyone. I loved the pattern. There's a link in the description if you want to get the same pattern that I did. You can either download and print it off from their website, or you can also just get a paper pattern sent to you. Overall, I would definitely do again. I liked the process of it. I love the jacket I'm going to be wearing a lot, and that's all. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. And remember, done is better than perfect, and I'll see you in the next one.